Welcome and thank you everyone for tuning in to our latest Economic Outlook report focused on what's next for today's consumer in the post-pandemic world. This is our second presentation in the series that we are doing with Nielsen. And joining us today on this call again is special guest Nicole Collida, Nielsen SVP and US Brand Effectiveness Lead. We're pleased to have Nicole with us today. She is known for her ability to create differentiated value in the marketplace by measuring the evolving consumer patterns. This has made her an invaluable asset within the industry, so welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be back with Andrew and the team at Prevedere.
We're excited to have you back and for today's discussion. And per usual, please welcome Prevedere's Chief Economist Andrew Duguay, who will provide a U.S. economic recovery overview and likely scenarios that we can expect throughout the rest of the year. Andrew, it would make sense, I believe, to start with you and get an overall feel for how the economy is and what we're seeing in terms of consumer sentiment.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nicole, and looking forward to today's discussion as well. I think it makes sense that we talk about the broader economic picture first, so we get some pretty good context as we dive deep into Nielsen's treasure trove of data and analytics on the consumer and get to understand all the different fluctuations that are going on. We've seen, of course, many different patterns over the last few months with consumer spending as everything has been disrupted. And we know that this all really ties back to the health crisis itself that started this. So in order to get a good context for how is recovery going to go, we need to think about not just our businesses opening up, but do people feel safe? And I think that's going to be a big theme throughout the summer and the fall. We know that things are returning back to quote normal from maybe business hours standpoint, right? Less and less restrictions on businesses going state by state, and obviously where you live, it matters when things are going to open up, but there's a plan to open up. Now, the business world is obviously left with a very different customer base than when they started, and this is going to impact sales, I think, just as much, if not more, than some of the restrictions that we've been placed temporarily on certain types of businesses. And this all ties back to the health and safety of US consumers, which ties back to the number of new COVID-19 cases as the pandemic continues to spread throughout the world. So at a good list, I wanted to show you the number of new cases daily. And so this is not a compounding number, this is the actual total number of new daily cases around there. And you can see from a world perspective, the problem is still escalating. Now, a lot of these new cases are now in emerging markets that were delayed. So we know we started in Asia, shifted towards Europe, then it hit the United States. Now we're seeing, increases in places like Brazil and India. So this is making the world number move even higher. However, in the United States, we have, I think, successfully surpassed the peak in the daily number of new cases, which is the good news. I think the word of caution is that if you really look at our trend, we haven't seen a real decline in the number of new cases in the last several weeks, or you could even say months, right? We've essentially flattened the curve, but we've yet to bend the curve in a downward direction significantly. So we saw a quick ramp up, and now we're kind of plateauing at around 20,000 new cases every single day. And for that means that the spread of the virus is still ongoing, and that people are likely, whether forced to or not, are going to be recommended to distance from each other, and that's going to change consumer habits significantly through the summer months into the second half of the year, and this is going to have economic ramifications. As we do reopen, obviously that leaves more people exposed. So we do have to consider the fact that, as we try to get back to some level of normalcy, that does increase the risk of spread. But I think the concerning part is that levels have not really decreased over the past few weeks significantly. You can see that trend just oscillating there with maybe a slight downward slope. So we'll continue to watch that, but this is far from over. So I think the key takeaway is that consumers are going to be impacted by this in their habits for quite a while. So when we look out towards the second half of the year and even into next year in planning, what do we think is the most likely scenario? Well, if you've been listening to Prevedere, we've been talking about there are many scenarios to consider, but the most likely one is probably a U-shaped recovery, that this sort of quick return back to normal is a very small likelihood, I think. And Nicole is going to dive into some of the deeper data, but what we've been seeing is that really when you talk to consumers and you measure them, most consumers feel and have been acting as if they're in this for the long run, right? That things are not going to return back to normal, and they're developing new habits every day, new shopping habits. So from an economic standpoint, a lot of jobs have been displaced, and we're going to see a lot. We're going to talk about, a lot of changes to income trends and stimulus, but a U-shaped recovery really means that the second half of the year in the United States is going to be weak, but there is going to be recovery, and would really be back towards 2021, the latter half of 2021, before things, get, I think, back on that trend of back to normal, if you would, all else equal. And there's still downside risk, right? Is there a second wave? We've seen that we haven't really lowered the number of new cases recently. So there's a lot of still downside risk to this, that we might need to go through extra measures if we don't get this thing under control. I think it's stabilized, but stabilized at an elevated level, and that still has some concerns. So given that this is an economic crisis that's really was preceded by a health crisis that's still ongoing, we do need to consider the ramifications there. So let's dive into what this means for the consumer. Well, first off, there has been an unprecedented level in many ways of stimulus put into this. What we're looking at here is government social benefit transfers on a monthly basis. And we can see that the CARES Act was generous by US government historic standards, if you could say the least, in its stimulus effort. So the last time there was a major stimulus in the US was in 2008 with the last recession. And these were included around $600 to $1,200 one-time payments. We've doubled that in this CARES Act in just less than 10 years later to the $1,200 to $2,400 one-time payments, plus with almost a quarter of Americans getting temporary or permanent job displacement, the US federal government has implemented a $600 weekly extra unemployment benefits, which also is contributing to that boost. So we look by historic standards, there's a very large amount of government action right now to try to essentially soften the blow of the shelter in place policies that have been enacted. And what this has done, interestingly enough, has really, I think, delayed some of the effects to the consumer, because many consumers, even if they've had such a drastic life change, such as losing their job, it might not be necessarily feeling the effects of it because of the very generous stimulus this time, right? Around 40% of those collecting unemployment are getting paychecks that are on average larger than what they were earning before when they were employed. So what this could mean is that there's some delayed effects to government, to consumer spending because of the generous government actions on the stimulus that could kick in sort of, I would call it we talk about second waves of the pandemic, but a second economic wave where first we're seeing just a lot of disruptions from shelter in place, but secondly, we could see a lot of disruption this summer as some of these stimulus measures start to expire, but not all those jobs that were lost suddenly reappear. A lot of people could be anticipating that they're getting their job back, but could find out that their job just no longer exists, or that their job exists, but in a muted capacity where they might be working part-time versus full-time. We've seen people obviously cut back their spending on restaurants a lot by force, but it'll be very interesting as we move through the summer months how much people are cutting back on their spending and what that does to employment in the travel, hospitality, and restaurant space. But in the near term, what we've seen is that we've had a significant boost in incomes. And now, and Nicole will dive into this, what we've seen is this has not translated into a ginormous boost in spending, but at least we've seen on the income side of the equation that whether you're looking at after-tax real disposable personal income or just real personal income, what we've seen is actually a record year-over-year boost in incomes, to the tune of around 14% on a year-over-year basis. You could back this data up all the way down back to 1960. We've never seen a spike like this. This is obviously coming from the one-time stimulus payment checks plus the extra unemployment benefit checks, which means that either you're working and you're still getting paid, you're just working from home, right, and life changes, or you've been laid off and you're getting unemployment benefits, and then everybody on top of that is getting a stimulus check, so that 2.1 trillion boost. Now, this will come back down, right, because of the temporary nature of a lot of that stimulus. But for now, what we see is that that trend was in March, incomes were starting to decline, which looks traditionally like it would, ahead of a recession. And then we stepped in with some aggressive stimulus, which has boosted that. So this gives a lot of consumers the ability to spend. Now, the real challenge is, are they going to spend? And so I think this is where the hard data, such as income and employment, I think really gets overrun in the near term by the soft data. Is like, do consumers feel comfortable spending? Are they willing to spend? Are they still in fear of losing their job if they haven't? Or are they in fear of their job not coming back if they're already unemployed? That a lot of the psychological effects of this are very extreme and very real and will dictate consumer spending, I think, in the next few months. And so we have to take some of this hard data and really pair it with a lot of what we call softer data, sentiment and intent type metrics from a lot of consumer surveys, I think are proving themselves very valuable in the economic space to understand what is going on. Because when you look at some of the traditional metrics, such as unemployment rates, well, what you're finding is that there's really a mixed message going out there. And no case is better than what happened last week when we looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics employment rate data. There was a big surprise, a positive surprise, when 2.5 million jobs were created in May. This was a surprise because what that survey of economists right before this data release said that there was going to be 8 million jobs lost in May. So people were shocked on the upside for this, but this comes with a lot of caveats. So for one, there's a wide range of error right now in a lot of statistics due to coronavirus, right? The same challenge we're all facing is happening at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where they're having a harder time getting outreach to get good survey numbers. There's been a dip in the response rate to that household survey that gives you that unemployment rate from 82 to 67%, which widens the margin of error. And there's also some misclassification errors and notes that they lay out. So sure, unemployment rate might have declined to 13.6%, which is still very high, but there could be a possible 3% increase in that number from due to misclassification error, which would make the real unemployment rate 16.6%. Either way you look at it, whether you're at that red circle up there or where the blue line sits with the official number, you look back in history and you realize that, hey, even with those jobs created in May and the fact that in June and July, a lot of those temporary jobs that were lost are going to come back. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. We went from record low unemployment to historically very high unemployment in a very short period of time. This leaves a lot of disruption and a lot of changes in consumer habits as a result. So in a highlight, while I transition it to Nicole to dive into some of the Nielsen analytics, from our end at Prevedere, I think some of the suggestions that we're telling our customers is, one is, don't narrowly focus on just a few indicators, right? If you just look at the unemployment data from last month, you might get really excited at that fact that we might be in a very quick recovery. And looking at the broader context, there's still a lot of challenges for us to face. The second is that consumer intent is key. I talked about hard data and soft data. Consumer intent being that softer data about how consumers feel about spending, I think is really going to drive a lot of spending because what we're seeing a lot of increase in incomes just due to stimulus, but a lot of people are saving that money because they're cautious in many different ways. And so how consumers feel about spending in certain categories is going to be much more important than their ability to spend in certain categories, at least over the next few months. I think there is cautious optimism still on the reopening of the U.S. economy. We said the number of cases are still very high, but any sort of move towards normalcy is a good one in healing the economy and the damage that's been caused. But there's still real hurdles ahead, and I think part of this is our transition away from a stimulus-driven economy towards the traditional supply and demand in the labor market. So a couple of these is the fact that the PPP loans for mid-small size businesses are designed to cover payrolls for 8 weeks, and those 8 weeks are expiring, starting with the last few weeks and going on. So our business is going to be able to keep people on payrolls as that government stimulus expires. And then on the employee side, the expanded unemployment benefits are set to expire July 31st. So what is the labor market going to look like in August, as well as people's incomes? Because if they're just relying on state unemployment and not this extra $600 a week, there could be some real challenges and changes to spending dynamics as a result of that. So in summary, I think we need to continue to pay attention to new COVID cases, and we expect a slow recovery extending to 2021. There's still a wide range of outcomes, but we do expect recovery to happen the second half of the year. It's just going to be a slower one. Think more of a U-shaped recovery than a V-shaped when it comes to the shape of this recovery, due to just the massive disruptions to the labor market in the United States and around the world. So with that, I'm going to transition it to Nicole to talk about some of Nielsen's findings lately.
Thanks so much, Andrew. You set me up perfectly with your comments on hard and soft data. It's certainly no secret that the world has dramatically changed just over the past 4 months. And a lot of the changes in the global economies, or a lot of that hard data that you referenced, as well as consumer sentiment, or the softer side of things, are driving significant changes in consumer behavior. So understanding those changes and ultimately planning for them are really critical to our future success. Okay, so let's bring these changes to life just a little bit. Economically, 1 in 4 Americans have filed for unemployment during the pandemic. And Andrew, you talked quite a bit around the level of accuracy in those numbers and just how high that number could potentially go. I think anecdotally, I'd even say I heard of a lot of people, in my community that were unemployed for a short period of time, but didn't file for unemployment just simply due to the barriers to entry, right? Long wait times, et cetera. So it's interesting to try to understand just how many Americans did experience unemployment during this pandemic. At the same time, it's really in stark contrast. When we think about food and beverage and CPG sales, we're seeing $50 billion in incremental growth that's occurred year over year in the CPG space. And interestingly, 70% of that growth was from true increased consumption. We know there was a lot of stockpiling that happened during the pandemic, but 70% of that 50 billion really was consumed by consumers in an increased fashion year over year. So on the surface, the CPG industry as a whole looks relatively rosy when you think about the boom that's happened as a result of COVID. But when we dig a little deeper, we see a different sort of story start to emerge. While we see grocery volume really thriving, we know that a lot of the growth in grocery comes at the expense of the restaurant industry. If you think about the peak of the pandemic lockdowns, when things were really starting to shut down in mid to late March, grocery volume surged at close to 77% growth year over year. But restaurant volume over that week and then the 5 weeks that followed suffered a minimum of really 50% loss for those 5 consecutive weeks. When you think about that picture in total, what you see is that household food and beverage expenditures were down 10% year over year. So while we saw significant growth in the CPG food and beverage space, it was not enough to make up for the declines that we saw in food and beverage that were happening on the restaurant side. So all in all, we see that consumers were spending about 10% less. And that gives a little bit of new context to that 50 billion growth number that we're quoting for the CPG industry. And when we move outside of just food and beverage or just CPG, we see even more divergent trends. Here, we're looking at traditional CPG, and when I talk about that, I'm really thinking about food, beverage, home, and personal care, things that you get in your typical grocer or mass merchandiser store on your weekly shopping trip. When we compare those trends to non-CPG or things like apparel and home goods, luxury items, we start to see a really different story. We see dramatic year-over-year declines in the non-CPG space at the height of the pandemic. So we saw consumers shift their spending into CPG, which is represented by the blue line here, and really decrease their spending in a year-over-year comparison in non-CPG. The first time that we saw non-CPG volumes start to tick back towards normal, or at least flat to year-ago trends, was when the first wave of the stimulus checks were released. But let's dig into that just one step further. Andrew talked about the fact that of those households that are unemployed, 40% of them are making more money than they were when they were employed. We know they're spending more on CPG. We know they're spending less in restaurants, and we see them spending the same or less in non-CPG categories as well as they were a year ago. So in total, consumer spending has dropped when we think about these CPG and non-CPG categories that we're measuring. We know that this is all due to consumer sentiment. So Andrew referenced this idea of whether or not consumers feel safe. And the soft data here supports that consumer sentiment is generally misaligned with how they're spending their dollars. In recent consumer research that we conducted, we found that 54% of consumers said that they were quote unquote ready to go as it related to getting back to a new normal. This is a 20-point increase over just 4 weeks ago. Even more telling is the consumers that said they were going to wait and see what a new normal might look like before they could, say whether or not they were ready to embrace it. That number decreased by 18 points. We are down to only 11% of consumers saying that they're going to wait and see. But we need to understand what a new normal will really look like. So as we've talked to consumers, we do see that this new normal will look quite different for many. We asked consumers about their top behaviors that have been impacted during the pandemic and how long they expect those impacts to last. So whether it's cooking at home or working at home, whether it's travel or dining out, the majority of consumers that we surveyed said that not only have their behaviors changed dramatically or been impacted by the pandemic, but the majority of them told us that they expect their behaviors to be impacted for a minimum of 4 months into the future. This tells us that whatever this new normal is will be dramatically different from the normal we experienced prior to COVID. And this really comes to life in a couple different ways, but one significant way that we're seeing it come to life is this idea of health-minded buying. What and where consumers purchase will shift over time as we move into this new normal. 29% of consumers are telling us that they're going to change to be more focused on health-minded buying for at least the next 6 months. And 43% of consumers are telling us that they're going to make those purchases online. So again, what they're buying and where they're buying it is shifting. When we think about when they're buying or how they're making these purchase decisions, we see several claims really rise to the top of importance for consumers. These claims are primarily about bacteria, which I don't think is really very surprising probably to anyone. But the claims that are rising to the top for consumers are really around killing and protecting against bacteria and keeping themselves and their families safe. We know that all of these changes will also impact summer holidays. Early data shows that we really experienced softened growth versus year ago for the key kickoff summer holidays of Easter and Memorial Day weekend. We saw growth in 2020 as compared to 2019, but what we saw was a growth rate that didn't match year ago growth. We've seen that year-ago growth be pretty consistent throughout history as volume pops, as consumers start to get together to kick off the summer and really dive into, summer barbecues, family and friend events. This year, we're not going to see that in the same way that we have in past years based on this early data. What we will see is that what, where, and how consumers engage with CPG brands will really shift. And we think that how consumers shop in general will all be challenged across the categories they buy, the brands they buy, and the channels in which they shop. All of these behavioral changes really link back to changes in environment and in perception. Again, that hard and soft data. We've segmented consumers based on both. What you really see here is that from left to right, there are varying levels of impact to households across the US. On the left-hand side, when you think about health-minded crowd avoiders, you see households that were least impacted by changes in the economy as a result of the pandemic. And when you move to the right, to our stressed strugglers, what you see are the most impacted households. These households and these impacts that they've experienced correlate really, really closely to purchase behavior. Stressed strugglers are experiencing a much more limited ability to stock up on key needs for their households. They're very concerned about the financial impact the pandemic has had, and they're struggling to feel confident that they can keep their household safe. They've experienced a direct impact on their household finances, and of course, that's changing how much and what they can purchase. The health-minded crowd avoiders and the conscientious store shoppers are households that are much less impacted. They certainly understand the impact that COVID has had on their household decisions. They are avoiding crowds. They are generally seeking safer shopping options, but they're much more likely to return to their routines quicker into whatever their new normal is than the households that fall on the right-hand side of this chart will. As we progress, I think there are really two key things to watch. And the first is how these households behave over time. This will be a really key indicator for us on how we can expect to recover in the CPG and non-CPG space as we think about these impacted households. But I think there's another thing that we should really have on our minds as well. And this is how these impacted households might shift along the spectrum over time. Andrew pointed to unemployment plus-ups ending on July 31st and affected households returning to state-only unemployment. There could be a second wave that hits this fall or winter. All of these indicators, or all of these events could indicate changes in behavior. And I think one of the key things that we need to watch is how we see shifting between these groups. Do we see households that fall into conscientious store shoppers today start to slip into regular routine or at-risk solution seekers over time as this pandemic and the economic impact that it's caused persists in the market? So how do we think about going forward? There are a lot of lessons that we've learned over these last few months. We started with a perspective that was generally rosy when we were isolating into the CPG space. And what we've seen is an ability to open our eyes to a broader landscape and really understand what's happening in the broader consumer spending environment and how it affects all of us. What can we do to really address how these changes will impact the rest of the year and prepare for the effect that may have on our performance? I think there are really 5 key things. The first is to evolve with the consumer. Consumer behavior is evolving really quickly, and no one's just quite sure what that new normal will look like. So ensuring that you have a fluid strategy that allows you to move with the consumer will set you up for success. Planning for the holidays accordingly will be key. The early indicators tell us that the summer holidays aren't going to look like the holidays of past summers. Being aware and looking ahead to that will help you succeed with the plans that you have in place. I can't say enough about understanding your pricing and promotional strategy. While we didn't dig into it in detail today, we see the price consumers are paying at the shelf continue to rise as a result of limited stock on shelves, reduced number of brands, and retailers trying to recoup some of the expenses that they've had to cover in terms of additional employees or additional safety precautions for employees and for consumers. Along those same lines, it's really important that you optimize your production, distribution, and assortment. Those go hand in hand to make sure that the consumer supply can match the demand in the marketplace. And then finally, be sure that you're diversifying your channel strategy. Companies that place all of their bets in one basket will be the most susceptible to harm as we move through these changes in this environment. Understanding how you can meet consumers where they need you to be with your products or with your service will be critical to your success. So once again, Andrew and team, I really thank you guys for having me. It was a great opportunity to shed some light on consumer sentiment and how that links back to the economic indicators that we're seeing in the marketplace. So thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Actually, thank you both. It's clear that consumer health is complicated for sure throughout the rest of the year, and the dialogue on understanding hard and soft data was truly fascinating. I feel like we could expand on this as well in the future, perhaps in our next recording together. So again, formally, Nicole, we sincerely appreciate having you and your view on the consumer environment and how it's shifting. Andrew, as always, thank you for your time. We hope that you will both join us again here. And that concludes this consumer-focused economic update. Stay tuned for our ongoing in this series, Prevedere and Nielsen reporting on the consumer sentiment. If you have any questions for either Nicole Collida or Andrew Duguay, please feel free to contact me directly and I will forward your inquiry.